I want to talk a little bit more about the elephant in the room that nobody really wants to acknowledge when it comes to inflation, because this is a very important point. Nobody is talking about it except for me. Middle class Americans, poorer working Americans are really complaining about inflation now. And politicians are feeling their pain and they want to do something about it because they're afraid that a lot of these middle class and lower class voters who are hurting from inflation are going to take out their frustration at the polls. So the politicians want to do something about inflation and they want to make a big deal out of it. Hey, we got to get rid of inflation. We got to bring inflation down. But what they don't want to acknowledge and what nobody wants to admit is that we have been paying for government with inflation. I always talk about inflation being a tax, and inflation is the tax that middle class and lower class Americans are disproportionately bearing in order to cover the cost of government. The US government is spending a lot more money now than it spent before COVID. And in fact, during the years of the Trump administration, government spending continued to increase and taxes did not. In fact, we had tax cuts under Trump, but we never had any spending cuts. We had more spending. Trump spent more on warfare. He spent more on welfare. He added the Space Force. Well, we didn't get all this stuff for free. Now, Americans thought they were getting it for free because nobody raised their taxes. How did we get the money to pay for all this stuff? We just borrowed it. We sold more bonds and the Fed printed more money. So we paid for all this government with inflation. So now middle class Americans are getting the bill for all this government in the form of higher inflation. And they don't like it. They don't want to pay the inflation tax. They just don't realize it's a tax. Well, what they also don't realize is the only way to lower inflation is to find another way to pay for government. Because if the government is not going to create all this inflation, if the Fed is going to stop printing all this money and the government is going to stop borrowing money, well, where is it going to get the money to cover all this spending? It's got to get it from the middle class. It's not going to get it from the rich because there's not enough money in taxing the rich. It's like, why did Willie Sutton rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. Why do politicians have to tax the middle class? Because that's where the money is. There's not a lot of money to take from the rich. They're already paying a huge amount of income tax. If you try to tax them more, you may end up collecting less. But the other problem with taxing the rich, and I touched on this in my last podcast, and this applies to corporations, is when you tax the rich and corporations, they generally don't reduce their spending. They reduce their investment. Well, you need more capital investment. If you want to get more stuff in the supply chain, you got to make the stuff. And you can't make the stuff without the capital investment required to produce it. And so it's counterproductive if you take money away from investors and just send it to the government to spend. You're producing less and you're consuming more. That pushes prices up. The government has to raise taxes on the people who would spend the money. The way the government lowers inflation is by lowering the spending. So how do you lower spending? You've got to reduce the incomes of the middle class. You've got to reduce the incomes of the poor. Now, that doesn't sound very good. It's not, but that's the unfortunate reality because the government has been growing spending year after year after year, and no one has had to pay for it. They have been delaying the day of reckoning. Well, now the bills are coming due. The piper needs to be paid. Right now, we're paying the piper through inflation, and the poor and the middle class don't like it. They can't afford it. They want some relief. Well, they can't get relief from the inflation tax unless they're going to pay higher regular taxes. So what kind of relief is that? Okay, the way we're going to lower inflation is we're going to increase the payroll tax. We're going to increase your income tax. We're going to come up with a new national value added tax, right? These are ways that the government could take money away from the middle class and the poor so that they don't have to borrow as much and so the Fed doesn't have to print as much. Now, of course, another way to do this would be to cut spending. I mean, that would be my choice. Instead of raising taxes on the people who are already paying taxes, why don't we cut spending? Because the government has to reduce the money it's sending to people, like people who are collecting government pensions, people who are collecting Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, because those people are spending money they did not earn. I mean, maybe you can claim, well, they earned it because they paid into it, but as of right now, they are not contributing to society to get that money. They are not producing, adding goods and services into the economy. All they're doing is buying the goods and services that are already there. So if you want to bring down inflation, you have to stop people from spending money they did not earn, spending money that is not tied to productive activity. If you're not helping to produce, well, then you can't be consuming. And so the government has to find a way to reduce this consumption, and they can either do it by raising taxes or cutting spending. But they have to do something, because if they don't raise taxes and if they don't cut spending, it doesn't matter what the Fed does on interest rates, inflation's not going away, because government has to be paid for one way or another. There is no free lunch. And if the public were told the truth, there would be an uproar. They would be storming the Capitol. Talk about the riots that we had after Trump. Imagine the riots that we would have if the public actually knew what they were in for. That the only way to get rid of inflation is if their incomes are reduced by taxation, or if the government tells people who are living off of entitlements, these middle class entitlements, yes, we're going to get rid of inflation, but by the way, we're going to take 25% or 50% of your Social Security. We're going to have to send you less money. When I tweeted about this fact, a lot of people responded basically that I'm a heartless person, right? This is my solution. I want to raise taxes on the middle class. I want to cut benefits for the middle class. It's not about what I want to do or whether I'm heartless or not. It's about what has to be done. This is the unfortunate reality. If the government didn't want to impoverish the middle class, it never should have made government so expensive, because government has to be paid for. We don't get our government for free. And so if the politicians cared about the people, they wouldn't have spent the people's money like drunken sailors, but they did. And now the consequences can't be avoided. So am I happy that the poor and the middle class either have to pay much higher taxes or accept much lower benefits? No, I'm not happy about it, but that's the reality. If it was up to me, we wouldn't be in this situation, but it wasn't up to me. We had reckless politicians from both parties, and we had a reckless Federal Reserve that allowed this massive growth in government, and now we've got to pay the cost. We've either got to pay it with higher prices, inflation, or we're going to pay it through higher taxes or reduced benefits. Those are the only choices. There is no magic way out of it.